One of the things that orientates us and changes our priorities is trauma, and that's something you talk about in the book as well. The really fascinating thing that I've always been keen to ask somebody is about this idea of intergenerational trauma, which you've referenced a second ago. Because I wasn't sure if intergenerational trauma was just like woo-woo spiritual stuff, or whether it was real science, i.e. that the idea that your parents' trauma can be passed on to you somehow. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, and yes, it is true. It is true. It's what researchers are really exploring of how it's expressed in our descendants. And then we all have trauma just in our own life, right? And these are things that we can accumulate, and through things like therapy and somatic experiences and things like EMDR that I talk about, you can work on your trauma in your life. But for some of us, part of our trauma in our life today has to do with the trauma that our ancestors have gone through. So two geopolitical, historical things that were big things in our world were explored in the scientific literature to see how this plays out. One was a Ukrainian genocide, man-made famine in the early 20th century. Joseph Stalin, the Ukrainian people wanted to have freedom. Really nothing new is under the sun. Every time the Ukrainian people wanted to have freedom, there was some sort of authoritarian squash on their efforts. But this famine in the early 1900s was done on the Ukrainian people. Millions of people died. And what researchers have found is not just the people that went through this atrocity, their children and their grandchildren had the same methylation gene variants. Methylation is something that we quantify on labs. It's a sort of interconnected different biochemical pathways that impact inflammation levels, impact neurotransmitters and how our brain works, different detoxification pathways, that literally this trauma that the people went through during this Ukrainian genocide was passed on like an epigenetic heirloom of how genes were expressed by their experience. Similar research was done in the Holocaust and the descendants of people that went through the Holocaust in Germany and Poland. So yes, it sounds science fiction, but intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, looking at how trauma is literally stored in the cells and then passed on through family lines, is very much science. And it's shown that these people have increased likelihood of mental health issues, autoimmune issues, type 2 diabetes, different hormonal problems. And this is what's being explored in the science, but I could only imagine that it exists on a spectrum, that maybe all of our descendants haven't gone through the same things. But I think intuitively, again, we can know that there's certain behaviors and certain ways that people live in part because of what our ancestors have gone through. So yeah, that's what's being explored.
Feels a bit like it feels like a lot to deal with, like having to deal with my own trauma, let alone my great-grandparents' trauma as well, having a role in my life.
And in that way, I think that can make a lot of people can think about this. It's like, wow, I'm screwed. Like, if it wasn't, I have my own junk, let alone my ancestors' stuff.
And I'm going to pass my junk on to my kids.
Right. But I think, so for the average person, you don't necessarily even have to think about it because it's just where you're at today. But I would say this, if you shift your perspective and almost give yourself a little bit more grace, a little bit more forgiveness and compassion to say, wow, there are some big things at play here. And I see people up against seemingly insurmountable things that have gone through a lot of personal trauma as well as ancestral trauma, break the chains of dysfunction, break the chains of disease and disorder in their life, and heal not only themselves, but heal their families, heal their children's children, heal generations they'll never get to see. So I think it's how you look at it. Yes, it's heavy, but as trauma can be inherited, so can healing.
Interesting. In that chapter where you talk about intergenerational trauma, you also talk about polyvaginal theory. Big word, big phrase. Yeah. What is polyvaginal theory? Polyvagal.
Oh,
right. Of course, I got vaginal. Jesus Christ. We'll keep that in. Is there anything called polyvaginal theory?
Probably. We have to learn about that together. I don't know.
Well, let's talk about polyvagal theory instead then, if you don't know anything about polyvaginal.
That'll be the next episode. The After Dark episode. Polyvagal theory is, well, it gets its name in part because of the vagus nerve. It's the largest cranial nerve in the body, right? And it translates from the word wandering or wanderer, and it sort of wanders from the brain down into the gut. And it's the main nerve that's responsible for our parasympathetic, our resting, digesting, our sort of zenned out, hormone balanced state, of which that aspect of our autonomic nervous system is weakened, or what researchers call many of us have a poor vagal tone. Our vagus nerve is weak, our parasympathetic is weak, because our sympathetic, that fight or flight stressed, super productive, always on the go, type A, is really strong. It's really overactive.
So the sympathetic nervous system is where the fight or flight, the stress responses happen, and then the parasympathetic nervous system is ultimately what calms us down.
Yes, exactly. And both are important.
Okay.
Both are important. It's about, but many of us have a dysregulated nervous system response because of this sort of imbalance within the autonomic nervous system. And then the enteric nervous system is sort of the third aspect of our autonomic nervous system. But polyvagal theory is a way to understand how trauma can be stored in our body. So there's three main, in this sort of study of the human nervous system, there's the dorsal vagal, sympathetic, the ventral vagal. It's understanding how upon this continuum can the human nervous system reside. So can we be in this sort of, I'm in a state of calm and protected and I'm grounded and I'm in balance, all the way to sympathetic, fight or flight, all the way to I am under threat, I am shutting down, I'm in hypervigilance. And the end stage of that is something called dysautonomia or dysautonomia. It is when the nervous system is perpetually stuck in that fight or flight state, that's a diagnosable disorder. But again, polyvagal attempts to describe how these things exist on a spectrum, to understand how things like thoughts and emotions, trauma, shame, our bodies are like cellular libraries where we're storing all of these things. And the thoughts we speak, the thoughts we're thinking, the words we speak are literally stored in our cells. And we have trillions of cells that are listening intently to how we speak and how we live our life. So that's what polyvagal theory is talking about.
So in essence, there's these three states where you're relaxed. In state one, state two, you have sort of acute stress, small amounts of stress. And then in state three, you have severe things like burnout and, physiological collapse, I guess.
Yeah.
And what sort of proportion of the population do you think are living in each state there?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume when you look at the statistics of chronic disease and the fact that you're talking, depending on the study that you look at, 60 to 80% of the West, US, UK, all Western countries are dealing with some massive metabolic issues, which is very much stress related. Food plays a part of it because unhealthy foods that don't love us back is also stressful, but also the mental, emotional, spiritual stress of it. When you look at the phenomenon of insulin resistance, of which is the leading cause of heart disease in the world and doubles the risk of many cancers as well, that phenomenon of metabolic issues and hyperinsulinemia or excess insulin and glucose issues, that's the vast majority of people.